Hello everyone, welcome back to our live reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. I'm Libba Beaucham here at the Northeast Georgia History Center in the Cottrell Digital Studio. And if you're just joining us, I do recommend that you go back and start from the very beginning. You can find those videos on our Facebook tab or our YouTube channel. So to catch us up, we're actually starting on a new direction. Our characters are now going toward the Indian Peninsula in a northwest direction. That's where we last left off. And but I did want to start because I found this really awesome blog that is perfect for us because it goes through the species of aquatic life that are mentioned in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And I know that I have been struggling with those scientific terms, so at least we can get a picture in our mind of what exactly I'm talking about. So let me find that for us. Here we go. So if you want to look at this blog yourself, just go to Tumblr, and the title is 20,000 Fish Under the Sea. But we're going to go through some of the fish and marine life that they mention. So the first is this really interesting looking animal, question mark? Let's read about it. So this is, okay, this is known as a sea pen. I'll go a little bit down. You can see that there is a description with each. I'll read the description while y'all can look at the actual picture. And so the sea pen, they consist of 22 different species. Some of the many coral species are known as sea pens. And Monsieur Aronnax, our narrator and main character, identified an admirable genus Vigulari from Norwegian waters. So that's one of the species that we have come across. Let's keep going down. So that's the sea pen, very interesting creature. Let's see, let's keep going. Ah, yes, so we have the mullet. So mullets consist of two distinctly related families of fish. There's gray mullets, and consisting of about 80 species, and the red mullets consisting of 2 species. So the distinction between gray and red mullets is only necessary in Europe, it says, as red mullets are called goatfish outside the continent. The mullet Monsieur Aronnax described, seen in the Western Pacific, quote, some bewhiskered mullet marked with a double line of black. Let's see, does not seem to match any known species of mullet. So he might have been describing a fictional species that they have discovered. Ooh, this is interesting. Another sea pen, a different type of sea pen, so we can see another version of that. The sea pen coral. Okay, so this is indeed a coral. Is a soft coral in one of the 16 families of the order of, let's try this, Penatolsia. All right, let's keep going. Ah, we have the green wrasse right here, a type of fish. Let's see, it mentions that, so these are commonly known as green wrasse. The passengers of the Nautilus, then traveling off the coast of Japan, could only have seen this type of species that we see, and is easily identified by the single black spot on its dorsal fin we see right up there. Let's keep going. Ah, we have the sea fan. This looks like a type of coral. So we have, in Nemo's cases, so this is on display in the Nautilus, is the Isis coral from the Molucca Islands. So this is, the genus is Isis, I-S-I-S, and this is, so this is one of the corals that is on display in the Nautilus, but it's also commonly known as a sea fan. We have here an illustration of a Chinese stingray. So here we have this. I'll go up and down so you can see the whole thing. Let's see, and it says here, this is a rare species whose actual existence was still in doubt when this was written. But let's see, not much is known about the Chinese stingray. Its official conservation status is data deficient. Okay, so this is a very rare stingray. We'll do a few more. Here we have the Gorgonian coral. Beautiful right there, fanning out. We'll go through a few more. We have the Chinese triggerfish, which is mentioned in, let's see, looks like Conseil mentions this when he's classifying the fish. Ooh, very pretty. Organ pipe coral. So you can see why these are so fascinating to Monsieur Aronnax. Oh, look at the narwhal. There we go. So that's what they thought they were looking for, a gigantic narwhal. So this is what a narwhal looks like. All right, so that's a bit of examples of all of the types of marine life. I thought that was such a cool blog to come upon, and it even cites the quotes in the book too, so I encourage you to follow that blog while we continue our journey. But speaking of our journey, let's go ahead and begin. I'm just gonna make sure our audio is good to go. All right, great. Okay, so I'm gonna back up just a little bit to get us back where we were. So they're starting on a new direction, a new course. Soon, Keeling Island disappeared from the horizon, and our course was directed to the northwest in the direction of the Indian Peninsula. From Keeling Island, our course was slower and more variable, often taking us into great depths. Several times they made use of the inclined planes, which certain interval levers placed obliquely to the waterline. In that way, we went about 2 miles, but without ever obtaining the greatest depths of the Indian Ocean, which soundings of 7,000 fathoms have never reached. As to the temperature of the lower strata, the thermometer invariably indicated 4 degrees above zero. I only observed that in the upper regions the water was always colder in the high levels than at the surface of the sea. On the 25th of January, the ocean was entirely deserted. The Nautilus passed the day on the surface, beating the waves with its powerful screw and making them rebound to a great height. Who under such circumstances would not have taken it for a gigantic cetacean? 3 parts of this day I spent on the platform. I watched the sea. Nothing on the horizon till about 4 o'clock, a steamer running west on our counter. Her masts were visible for an instant, but she could not see the Nautilus, being too low in the water. I fancied this steamboat belonged to the P.O. Company, which runs from Ceylon to Sydney, touching at King George's Point in Melbourne. At 5 o'clock in the evening, before the fleeting twilight which binds night to day in tropical zones, Conseil and I were astonished by a curious spectacle. It was a shoal of Argonauts traveling along on the surface of the ocean. Now I'm going to quickly see if we can get a definition for Argonauts. A group of heroes who accompanied Jason on board the ship Argo in the quest for the Golden Fleece. So that is a mythical version, but let's see, Argonauts. So I guess it's certainly people that he's seen. Or perhaps it's a type of fish. What is a shoal? Let's use our context clues. Ah, a large number of fish. Okay, so there is a type of fish referred to, Argonauts. Here we go. It was a shoal of Argonauts traveling along on the surface of the ocean. We could count several hundreds. They belong to the tubercle kind, which are perpendicular to the Indian seas. These graceful mollusks moved backwards by means of their locomotive tube, through which they propelled the water already drawn in. Of their 8 tentacles, 6 were elongated and stretched out floating on the water, whilst the other 2, rolled up flat, were spread to the wing like a light sail. I saw their spiral-shaped and fluted shells, which Cuvier justly compares to an elegant skiff. A boat indeed. It bears the creature which secretes it without its adhering to it. For nearly an hour the Nautilus floated in the midst of this shoal of mollusks. Then I know not what sudden fright they took, but as if at a signal every sail was furled, the arms folded, the body drawn in, the shells turned over, changing their center of gravity, and the whole fleet disappeared under the waves. Never did the ships of a squadron maneuver with more unity. At that moment, night fell suddenly, and the reeds, scarcely raised by the breeze, lay peaceably under the sides of the Nautilus. The next day, the 26th of January, we cut the equator at the 82nd meridian and entered the northern hemisphere. During the day, a formidable troop of sharks accompanied us, terrible creatures, which multiply in these seas and make them very dangerous. They were Crustaceo philippi sharks, with brown backs and whitish bellies armed with 11 rows of teeth, eyed sharks, their throat being marked with a large black spot surrounded with white like an eye. There were also some Isabella sharks with rounded snouts marked with dark spots. These powerful creatures often hurled themselves at the windows of the saloon with such violence as to make us feel very insecure. At such times, Ned Land was no longer master of himself. He wanted to go to the surface and harpoon the monsters, particularly certain smooth hound sharks whose mouth is studded with teeth like a mosaic, and large tiger sharks, nearly 6 yards long, the last named of which seemed to excite him more particularly. But the Nautilus, accelerating her speed, easily left the most rapid of them behind. The 27th of January, at the entrance of the vast Bay of Bengal, we met repeatedly a forbidding spectacle, dead bodies floating on the surface of the water. They were the dead of the Indian villages, carried by the Ganges to the level of the sea, in which the vultures, the only undertakers of the country, had not been able to devour. But the sharks did not fail to help them at their funeral work. About 7 o'clock in the evening, the Nautilus, half immersed, was sailing in a sea of milk. At first sight, the ocean seemed lactified. Was it the effect of the lunar rays? No, for the moon, scarcely 2 days old, was still lying hidden under the horizon in the rays of the sun. The whole sky, though lit by the sidereal rays, seemed black by contrast with the whiteness of the waters. Conseil could not believe his eyes and questioned me as to the cause of this strange phenomenon. Happily, I was able to answer him. It is called a milk sea, I explained. A large extent of white wavelets often to be seen on the coasts of Amboina and in these parts of the sea. But, sir, said Conseil, can you tell me what causes such an effect? For I suppose the water is not really turned into milk. No, my boy, and the whiteness which surprises you is caused only by the presence of myriads of infusoria, a sort of luminous little worm, gelatinous and without color, of the thickness of a hair, and whose length is not more than 7/1000ths of an inch. These insects adhere to one another sometimes for several leagues. Several leagues? Exclaimed Conseil. Yes, my boy. And you need not try to compute the number of these infusoria. You will not be able, for, if I am not mistaken, ships have floated on these milk seas for more than 40 miles. Towards midnight, the sea suddenly resumed its usual color, but behind us, even to the limits of the horizon, the sky reflected the whitened waves, and for a long time seemed impregnated with the vague glimmerings of an aurora borealis. Chapter 2. A novel proposal of Captain Nemo's. On the 28th of February, when at noon the Nautilus came to the surface of the sea in 9 degrees and 4 degrees northerly latitude, there was land in sight about 8 miles to westward. The first thing I noticed was a range of mountains about 2,000 feet high, the shapes of which were most capricious. On taking the bearings, I knew that we were nearing the island of Ceylon, the pearl which hangs from the lobe of the Indian peninsula. Captain Nemo and his second appeared at this moment. The captain glanced at the map, then turning to me said, "The island of Ceylon, noted for its pearl fisheries. Would you like to visit one of them, Monsieur Aronnax?" "Certainly, Captain." "Well, the thing is easy, though if we see the fisheries, we shall not see the fishermen. The annual exportation has not yet begun. Never mind, I will give you orders to make the Gulf of Mannar, where we shall arrive in the night." The captain said something to his second, who immediately went out. Soon the Nautilus returned to her native element, and the manometer showed that she was about 30 feet deep. "Well, sir," said Captain Nemo, "you and your companions shall visit the Bank of Mannar, and if by chance some fisherman should be there, we shall see him at work." "Agreed, Captain." "By the by, Monsieur Aronnax, are you not afraid of sharks?" "Sharks?" exclaimed I. This question seemed a very hard one. "Well," continued Captain Nemo, "I admit, Captain, that I am not yet very familiar with that kind of fish." "We are accustomed to them," replied Captain Nemo, "and in time you will be too. However, we shall be armed, and on the road we may be able to hunt some of the tribe. It is interesting. So, till tomorrow, sir, and early." This said in a careless tone, Captain Nemo left the saloon. Now, if you were invited to hunt the bear in the mountains of Switzerland, what would you say? Very well, tomorrow we will go and hunt the bear. If you were asked to hunt the lion in the plains of Atlas or the tiger of the Indian jungles, what would you say? Ha ha, it seems we are going to hunt the tiger or the lion. But when you are invited to hunt the shark in its natural element, you would perhaps reflect before accepting the invitation. As for myself, I passed my hand over my forehead on which stood large drops of cold perspiration. Let us reflect, said I, and take our time. Hunting otters in submarine forests, as we did in the island of Crespo, will pass, but going up and down at the bottom of the sea, where one is almost certain to meet sharks, is quite another thing. I know well that in certain countries, particularly in the Andaman Islands, the Negroes never hesitate to attack them with a dagger in one hand and a running noose in the other. But I also know that few who affront those creatures ever return alive. However, I am not a Negro, and if I were, I think a little hesitation in this case would not be ill-timed. At this moment, Conseil and the Canadian entered, quite composed and even joyous. They knew not what awaited them. "Faith, sir," said Ned Land, "your Captain Nemo, the devil take him, has just made us a very pleasant offer." "Ah," said I, "you know, if agreeable to you, sir," interrupted Conseil, "the commander of the Nautilus has invited us to visit the magnificent Ceylon fisheries tomorrow in your company. He did it kindly and behaved like a real gentleman." "He said nothing more?" "Nothing more, sir, except that he had already spoken to you of this little walk." "Sir," said Conseil, "would you give us some details of the pearl fishery?" "As to the fishing itself," I asked, "or the incidents which?" "On the fishing," replied the Canadian. "Before entering upon the ground, it is as well to know something about it." "Very well. Sit down, my friends, and I will teach you." Ned and Conseil seated themselves on an ottoman, and the first thing the Canadian asked was, "Sir, what is a pearl?" "My worthy Ned," I answered, "to the poet a pearl is a tear of the sea. To the Orientals it is a drop of dew solidified. To the ladies it is a jewel of an oblong shape, of a brilliancy of mother-of-pearl substance, which they wear on their fingers, their necks, or their ears. For the chemist, it is a mixture of phosphate and carbonate of lime, with a little gelatin, and lastly, for naturalists, it is simply a morbid secretion of the organ that produces the mother-of-pearl amongst certain bivalves." Branch of mollusks," said Conseil. "Precisely so, my learned Conseil, and amongst these testacea, the ear shell, the Tridinae, the turbots, in a word, all those which secrete mother-of-pearl, that is, the bluish, violet, or white substance which lines the interior of their shells, are capable of producing pearls." "Mussels, too?" asked the Canadian. "Yes, mussels of certain waters in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Saxony, Bohemia, and France." "Good. For the future I shall pay attention," replied the Canadian. "But," I continued, "the particular mollusk which secretes the pearl is the pearl oyster, the Meleagrina margaritefect, that precious pentadine. The pearl is nothing but a nacreous formation, deposited in a globular form, either adhering to the oyster shell or buried in the folds of the creature. On the shell it is fast, in the flesh it is loose, but always has for a kernel a small hard substance, maybe a barren egg, maybe a grain of sand, around which the pearly matter deposits itself year after year successively and by thin concentric layers." Are many pearls found in the same oyster?" asked Conseil. "Yes, my boy, some are a perfect casket. One oyster has been mentioned, though I allow myself to doubt it, as having contained no less than 150 sharks." 150 sharks!" exclaimed Ned Land. "Did I say sharks?" said I hurriedly. I meant to say 150 pearls. Sharks would not be sense." "Certainly not," said Conseil. "But will you tell us now by what means they extract these pearls?" "They proceed in various ways. When they adhere to the shell, the fishermen often pull them off with pincers, but the most common way is to lay the oysters on mats of the seaweed which covers the banks. Thus they die in the open air, and at the end of 10 days they are in a forward state of decomposition. They are then plunged into large reservoirs of seawater, Then they are opened and washed. The price of these pearls varies according to their size? Asked Conseil. Not only according to the size, I answered, but also according to their shape, their water, that is, their color, and their luster, that is, that bright and diappeared sparkle, which makes them so charming to the eye. The most beautiful are called virgin pearls, or paragons. They are formed alone in the tissue of the mollusk, are white, often opaque, and sometimes have the transparency of an opal. They are generally round or oval. The rounds are made into bracelets, the oval into pendants, and being more precious, are sold singly. Those adhering to the shell of the oyster are more irregular in shape and are sold by weight. Lastly, in a lower order are classed those small pearls known under the name of seed pearls. They are sold by measure and are especially used in embroidery for church ornaments. But, said Conseil, is this pearl fishery dangerous? No, I answered quickly, particularly if certain precautions are taken. What does one risk in such a calling? Said Ned Land. The swallowing of some mouthfuls of seawater? As you say, Ned, by the by, said I, trying to take Captain Nemo's careless tone. Are you afraid of sharks, brave Ned? I, replied the Canadian, a harpooner by profession. It is my trade to make light of them. But, said I, it is not a question of fishing for them with an iron swivel, hoisting them into the vessel, cutting off their tails with a blow of a chopper, ripping them up and throwing their heart into the sea. Then it is a question of, precisely, in the water, in the water. Faith, with a good harpoon, you know, sir, these sharks are ill-fashioned beasts. They turn on their bellies to seize you, and in that time, Ned Land had a way of saying seize, which made my blood run cold. Well, you and Conseil, what do you think of sharks? Me, said Conseil. I will be frank, sir. So much the better, thought I. If you, sir, mean the face of sharks, to face the sharks, I do not see why your faithful servant should not face them with you. Oh, so that was Conseil, yes. I should not face them with you. Here we go, on to Chapter 3, A Pearl of 10 Millions. Just gonna grab some water. Hi, Farah, welcome. Hi, Andrew. Everyone else. All right, Chapter 3, A Pearl of 10 Millions. The next morning at 4 o'clock, I was awakened by the steward whom Captain Nemo had placed in my service. I rose hurriedly, dressed, and went into the saloon. Captain Nemo was awaiting me. Monsieur Aronnax, said he, are you ready to start? I am ready. Then please to follow me. And my companions, Captain? They have been told and are waiting. Are we not to put on our divers' dresses? Asked I. Not yet. I have not allowed the Nautilus to come too near this coast, and we are some distance from the Manar bank. But the boat is ready and will take us to the exact point of disembarking, which will save us a long way. It carries our diving apparatus, which we will put on when we begin our submarine journey. Captain Nemo conducted me to the central staircase, which led on to the platform. Ned and Conseil were already there, delighted at the idea of this pleasure party which was being prepared. 5 sailors from the Nautilus, with their oars, waited in the boat, which had been made fast against the tide. The night was still dark. Layers of clouds covered the sky, allowing but few stars to be seen. I looked on the side where the land lay and saw nothing but a dark line enclosing 3 parts of the horizon, from southwest to northwest. The Nautilus, having returned during the night up the western coast of Ceylon, was now west of the bay, or rather gulf, formed by the mainland and the island of Manar. There, under the dark waters, stretched the Pentadine Bank, an inexhaustible field of pearls, the length of which is more than 20 miles. Captain Nemo, Ned Land, Conseil, and I took our places in the stern of the boat. The master went to the tiller, his 4 companions leaned on their oars, and the painter was cast off when we sheered off. The boat went towards the south. The oarsmen did not hurry. I noticed that their strokes, strong in the water, only followed each other every 10 seconds, according to the method generally adopted in the Navy. Whilst the craft was running by its own velocity, the liquid drops stuck the dark depths of the waves crisply like splats of melted lead. A little billow, spreading wide, gave a slight roll to the boat, and some samphire reeds flapped before it. We were silent. What was Captain Nemo thinking of? Perhaps the land he was approaching, and which he found too near to him, contrary to the Canadian's opinion, who thought it too far off. As to Conseil, he was merely there from curiosity. About 5:30, the first tints on the horizon showed the upper line of the coast more distinctly. Flat enough in the east, it rose a little to the south. 5 miles still lay between us, and it was indistinct owing to the mist of the water. At 6 o'clock, it became suddenly daylight, with that rapidity peculiar to tropical regions, which know neither dawn nor twilight. The solar rays pierced the curtain of the clouds piled up on the eastern horizon, and the radiant orb rose rapidly. I saw land distinctly, with a few trees scattered here and there. The boat neared Manar Island, which was rounded to the south. Captain Nemo rose from his seat and watched the sea. At a sign from him, the anchor was dropped, but the chain scarcely ran, for it was little more than a yard deep, and this spot was one of the highest points of the bank of Pentadines. "Here we are, Monsieur Aronnax," said Captain Nemo. "You see that enclosed bay? Here in a month will be assembled the numerous fishing boats of the exporters, and there are the waters their divers will ransack so boldly. Happily, this bay is well situated for that kind of fishing. It is sheltered from the strongest winds. The sea is never very rough here, which makes it favorable for the divers' work. We will now put on our dresses and begin our walk." I did not answer, and while watching the suspected waves, began with the help of the sailors to put on my heavy sea dress. Captain Nemo and my companions were also dressing. None of the Nautilus men were to accompany us on this new excursion. Soon we were enveloped to the throat in India rubber clothing, the air apparatus fixed to our backs by braces. As to the Ruhmkorff apparatus, there was no necessity for it. Before putting my head into the copper cap, I asked the question of the captain. "They would be useless," he replied. "We are going to no great depth, and the solar rays will be enough to light our walk. Besides, it would not be prudent to carry the electric light in these waters. Its brilliancy might attract some of the dangerous inhabitants of the coast most inopportunely." As Captain Nemo pronounced these words, I turned to Conseil and Ned Land. But my two friends had already encased their heads in the metal cap, and they could neither hear nor answer. My last question remained to ask of Captain Nemo. "And our arms?" asked I. "Our guns?" "Guns? What for? Do not mountaineers attack the bear with a dagger in their hand, and is not steel surer than lead? Here is a strong blade. Put it in your belt, and we start." I looked at my companions. They were armed like us, and more than that, Ned Land was brandishing an enormous harpoon, which he had placed in the boat before leaving the Nautilus. Then, following the captain's example, I allowed myself to be dressed in the heavy copper helmet, and our reservoirs of air were at once in activity. An instant after we were landed, one after the other in about 2 yards of water upon an even sand, Captain Nemo made a sign with his hand, and we followed him by a gentle declivity till we disappeared under the waves. Over our feet, like coveys of snipe in a bog, whose... I'll start over. Over our feet, like coveys of snipe in a bog, rose shoals of fish of the genus Monopetra, which have no other fins but their tail. I recognized the Havanese, a real serpent 2.5 feet long, of a livid color underneath, and which might easily be mistaken for a conger eel if it were not for the golden stripes on its side. In the genus Stromateuus, whose bodies are very flat and oval, I saw some of the most brilliant colors, carrying their dorsal fin like a scythe. An excellent eating fish, which, dried and pickled, is known by the name of carawade. Then some trencobars, belonging to the genus Apsiphoroides, whose body is covered with a shell cuirass of 8 longitudinal plates. The heightening sun lit the massive waters more and more. The soil changed by degrees. To the fine sand succeeded a perfect causeway of boulders, covered with a carpet of mollusks and zoophytes. Amongst the specimens of these branches, I noticed some placinae, with thin, unequal shells, a kind of ostracian peculiar to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Some orange lucinae with rounded shells, rockfish 3.5 feet long, which raised themselves under the waves like hands ready to seize one. There were also some panopeers, slightly luminous, and lastly some oculines, like magnificent fans forming one of the richest vegetations of the sea. In the midst of these living plants and under the arbors of the hydrophytes were layers of clumsy articulates, particularly some reninae, whose carapace formed a slightly rounded triangle, and some horrible-looking parthenopes. At about 7 o'clock, we found ourselves at last surveying the oyster banks on which the pearl oysters are reproduced by millions. Captain Nemo pointed with his hand to the enormous heap of oysters, and I could well understand that this mine was inexhaustible, for nature's creative power is far beyond man's instinct of destruction. Ned Land, faithful to his instinct, hastened to fill a net which he carried by his side with some of the finest specimens, but we could not stop. We must follow the captain, who seemed to guide himself by paths known only to himself. The ground was sensibly rising, and sometimes, on holding up my arm, it was above the surface of the sea. Then the level of the bank would sink capriciously. Often we rounded high rocks scarped into pyramids. In their dark fractures, huge crustacea, perched upon their high claws like some war machine, watched us with fixed eyes, and under our feet crawled various kinds of annelids. At this moment, there opened before us a large grotto dug in a picturesque heap of rocks and carpeted with all the thick warp of the submarine flora. At first it seemed very dark to me. The solar rays seemed to be extinguished by successive gradations until its vague transparency became nothing more than drowned light. Captain Nemo entered. We followed. My eyes soon accustomed themselves to this relative state of darkness. I could distinguish the arches springing capriciously from natural pillars, standing broad upon their granite base like the heavy columns of Tuscan architecture. Why had our incomprehensible guide led us to the bottom of this submarine crypt? I was soon to know. After descending a rather sharp declivity, our feet trod the bottom of a kind of circular pit. There Captain Nemo stopped, and with his hand indicated an object I had not yet perceived. It was an oyster of extraordinary dimensions, a gigantic tridacna, a goblet which could have contained a whole lake of holy water, a basin the breadth of which was more than 2.5 yards, and consequently larger than that ornamenting the saloon of the Nautilus. I approached this extraordinary mollusk. It adhered by its filaments to a table of granite, and there, isolated, it developed itself in the calm waters of the grotto. I estimated the weight of this tridacna at 600 pounds. Such an oyster would contain 30 pounds of meat, and one must have the stomach of a gargantua to demolish some dozens of them. Captain Nemo was evidently acquainted with the existence of this bivalve and seemed to have a particular motive in verifying the actual state of the tridacna. The shells were a little open. The captain came near and put his dagger between to prevent them from closing. Then with his hand he raised the membrane with its fringed edges, which formed a cloak for the creature. There, between the folded plates, I saw a loose pearl whose size equaled that of a coconut. Its globular shape, perfect clearness, and admirable luster made it altogether a jewel of inestimable value. Carried away by my curiosity, I stretched out my hand to seize it, weigh it, and touch it, but the captain stopped me, made a sign of refusal, and quickly withdrew his dagger, and the two shells closed suddenly. I then understood Captain Nemo's intention. In leaving this pearl hidden in the mantle of the tridacna, he was allowing it to grow slowly. Each year, the secretions of the mollusk would add new concentric circles. I estimated its value at 500,000 pounds at least. After 10 minutes, Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. I thought he had halted previously to returning. No, by a gesture he bade us crouch beside him in a deep fracture of the rock. His hand pointed to one part of the liquid mass, which I watched attentively. About 5 yards from me a shadow appeared and sank to the ground. The disquieting idea of sharks shot through my mind, but I was mistaken. And once again, it was not a monster of the ocean that had anything to do with it. It was a man, a living man, an Indian, a fisherman, a poor devil who I suppose had come to glean before the harvest. I could see the bottom of his canoe anchored some feet above his head. He dived and went up successively. A stone held between his feet, cut in the shape of a sugar loaf, whilst a rope fastened him to his boat, helped him to descend more rapidly. This was all his apparatus. Reaching the bottom about 5 yards deep, he went on his knees and filled his bag with oysters, picked up at random. Then he went up, emptied it, pulled up his stone, and began the operation once more, which lasted 30 seconds. The diver did not see us. The shadow of the rock hid us from sight. And how should this poor Indian ever dream that men, beings like himself, should be there under the water, watching his movements and losing no detail of the fishing? Several times he went up in this way and dived again. He did not carry away more than 10 at each plunge, for he was obligated to pull them from the bank to which they adhered by means of their strong byssus. And how many of those oysters for which he risked his life had no pearl in them? I watched him closely. His maneuvers were regular, and for the space of half an hour no danger appeared to threaten him. I was beginning to accustom myself to the sight of this interesting fishing when suddenly, as the Indian was on the ground, I saw him make a gesture of terror, rise, and make a spring to return to the surface of the sea. I understood his dread. A gigantic shadow appeared just before the unfortunate diver. It was a shark of enormous size, advancing diagonally, his eyes on fire and his jaws open. I was mute with horror and unable to move. The voracious creature shot towards the Indian, who threw himself on one side to avoid the shark's fins, but not its tail, for it struck his chest and stretched him on the ground. This scene lasted but a few seconds. The shark returned and, turning on his back, prepared himself for cutting the Indian in two when I saw Captain Nemo rise suddenly and then, dagger in hand, walk straight to the monster, ready to fight face to face with him. The very moment the shark was going to snap the unhappy fisherman in two, he perceived his new adversary and, turning over, made straight towards him. I can still see Captain Nemo's position, holding himself together. He waited for the shark with admirable coolness, and when it rushed at him, he threw himself on one side with a wonderful quickness, avoiding the shock and burying his dagger deep into its side. But it was not all over. A terrible combat ensued. The shark had seemed to roar, if I might say so. The blood rushed in torrents from its wound. The sea was dyed red, and through the opaque liquid I could distinguish nothing more until the moment when, like lightning, I saw the undaunted captain hanging on to one of the creature's fins, struggling, as it were, hand to hand with the monster, and dealing successive blows at his enemy, yet still unable to give a decisive one. The shark's struggles agitated the water with such fury that the rocking threatened to upset me. I wanted to go to the captain's assistance, but nailed to the spot with horror, I could not stir. I saw the haggard eye. I saw the different phases of the fight. The captain fell to the earth, upset by the enormous mass which leant upon him. The shark's jaws opened wide, like a pair of factory shears, and it would have been all over with the captain, but, quick as thought, harpoon in hand, Ned Land rushed towards the shark and struck it with its sharp point. The waves were impregnated with a mass of blood. They rocked under the shark's movements, which beat them with indescribable fury. Ned Land had not missed his aim. It was the monster's death rattle. Struck to the heart, it struggled in dreadful convulsions, the shock of which overthrew Conseil. But Ned Land had disentangled the captain, who, getting up without any wound, went straight to the Indian, quickly cut the cord which held him to a stone, took him in his arms, and with a sharp blow of his heel mounted to the surface. We all three followed in a few seconds, saved by a miracle, and reached the fisherman's boat. Captain Nemo's first care was to recall the unfortunate man to life again. I did not think he could succeed. I hoped so, for the poor creature's immersion was not long, for the blow from the shark's tail might have been his death blow. Happily, with the captain's and Conseil's sharp friction, I saw consciousness return by degrees. He opened his eyes. What was his surprise, his terror even, at seeing 4 great copper heads leaning over him. And above all, what must he have thought when Captain Nemo, drawing from his pocket of his dress a bag of pearls, placed in his hand? This munificent charity from the man of the waters to the poor Singhalese was accepted with a trembling hand. His wondering eyes showed that he knew not to what superhuman beings he owed both fortune and life. At a sign from the captain, we regained the bank, and following the road already traversed, came in about half an hour to the anchor which held the canoe of the Nautilus to the earth. Once on board, we each, with the help of the sailors, got rid of the heavy copper helmet. Captain Nemo's first word was to the Canadian. "Thank you, Master Land," said he. It was in revenge, Captain, replied Ned Land. I owed you that. A ghastly smile passed across the captain's lips, and that was all. To the Nautilus, said he. The boat flew over the waves. Some minutes after we met the shark's dead body floating. By the black marking of the extremity of the fins, I recognized this terrible melanopteron of the Indian seas, of the species of sharks so properly called. It was more than 25 feet long. Its enormous mouth occupied 1/3 of its body. It was an adult, as was known by its 6 rows of teeth placed in an isosceles triangle in the upper jaw. While I was contemplating this inert mass, a dozen of these voracious beasts appeared around the boat, and without noticing us, threw themselves upon the dead body and fought with one another for the pieces. At 8:30, we were again on board the Nautilus. There I reflected on the incidents which had taken place in our excursion to the Manar Bank. 2 conclusions I must inevitably draw from it, one bearing upon the unparalleled courage of Captain Nemo, the other upon his devotion to a human being, a representative of that race from which he fled beneath the sea. Whatever he might say, the strange man had not yet succeeded in entirely crushing his heart. When I made this observation to him, he answered in a slightly moved tone, "That Indian, sir, is an inhabitant of an oppressed country, and I am still and shall be, to my last breath, one of them." All right, moving on to Chapter 5, The Red Sea. In the course of the day of the 29th of January, the island of Ceylon disappeared under the horizon, and the Nautilus, at a speed of 20 miles an hour, slid into the labyrinth of canals which separate the Maldives from the Laccadives. It coasted even the island of Kiltan, a land originally coralline, discovered by Vasco da Gama in 1499, and one of the 19 principal islands of the Laccadive archipelago, situated between 10 degrees and 14 degrees 30, I'm not sure how to read these, to be honest, 10 and 14, 30 degrees northern longitude, 69, 50, and 72 degrees eastern longitude. We had made 16,220 miles, or 7,500 French leagues, from our starting point in the Japanese seas. The next day, the 30th of January, when the Nautilus went to the surface of the ocean, there was no land in sight. Its course was north by northeast in the direction of the Sea of Oman, between Arabia and the Indian Peninsula, which serves as an outlet to the Persian Gulf. It was evidently a block without any possible egress. Where was Captain Nemo taking us to? I could not say. This, however, did not satisfy the Canadian, who that day came to me asking where we were going. "We are going where our captain's fancy takes us, Master Ned." "His fancy cannot take us far, then," said the Canadian. "The Persian Gulf has no outlet, and if we do go in, it will not be long before we are out again." "Very well, then, we will come out again, Master Land, and if, after the Persian Gulf, the Nautilus would like to visit the Red Sea, the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb are there to give us entrance." "I need not tell you, sir," said Ned Land, "that the Red Sea has much close as a gulf, as the Isthmus of Suez is not yet cut, and if it was, a boat as mysterious as ours would not risk itself in a canal cut with sluices, and again, the Red Sea is not the road to take us back to Europe." "But I never said we were going back to Europe. What do you suppose, then?" "I suppose that, after visiting the curious coasts of Arabia and Egypt, the Nautilus will go down the Indian Ocean again, perhaps cross the Channel of Mozambique, perhaps off the Mascarenas, so as to gain the Cape of Good Hope." "And once at the Cape of Good Hope," asked the Canadian with peculiar emphasis, "well, we shall penetrate into that Atlantic which we do not yet know. Ah, friend Ned, you are getting tired of this journey under the sea. You are surfeited with the incessantly varying spectacle of submarine wonders. For my part, I shall be sorry to see the end of a voyage which it is given to so few men to make." For 4 days, till the 3rd of February, the Nautilus scoured the Sea of Oman at various speeds and at various depths. It seemed to go at random, as if hesitating as to which road it should follow, but we never passed the Tropic of Cancer. In quitting the sea, we sighted Muscat for an instant, one of the most important towns of the country of Oman. I admired its strange aspect, surrounded by black rocks upon which its white houses and forts stood in relief. I saw the rounded domes of its mosques, the elegant points of its minarets, its fresh and verdant terraces. But it was only a vision. The Nautilus soon sank under the waves of that part of the sea. We passed along the Arabian coast of Marah and Hadramaut for a distance of 6 miles, its undulating line of mountains being occasionally relieved by some ancient ruin. The 5th of February, we at last entered the Gulf of Aden, a perfect funnel introduced into the neck of Bab el-Mandeb, through which the Indian waters entered the Red Sea. The 6th of February, the Nautilus floated in sight of Aden, perched upon a promontory promontory, let's see what that is. Promontory, a point of high land that juts into a large body of water, a headland. Promontory, which a narrow isthmus, let's find out what that is, a narrow strip of land with sea, joins to the mainland. A kind of inaccessible Gibraltar, the fortifications of which were rebuilt by the English after taking possession in 1839. I caught a glimpse of the octagon minarets of this town, which was at one time the richest commercial magazine on the coast. I certainly thought that Captain Nemo, arrived at this point, would back out again, but I was mistaken, for he did no such thing, much to my surprise. The next day, the 7th of February, we entered the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, the name of which in the Arab tongue means the Gate of Tears. To 20 miles in breadth, it is only 32 in length, and for the Nautilus, starting at full speed, the crossing was scarcely the work of an hour. But I saw nothing, not even the island of Perim, with which the British government has fortified the position of Aden. There were too many English or French steamers of the line of Suez to Bombay, Calcutta to Melbourne, and from Bourbon to Mauritius, furrowing this narrow passage, for the Nautilus to venture to show itself. It remained prudently below. At last, about noon, we were in the waters of the Red Sea. I would not even seek to understand the caprice which had decided Captain Nemo upon entering the Gulf, but I quite approved of the Nautilus entering it. Its speed was lessened. Sometimes it kept on the surface, sometimes it dived to avoid a vessel, and thus I was able to observe the upper and lower parts of this curious sea. The 8th of February, from the first dawn of day, Mocha came into sight, now a ruined town whose walls would fall at a gunshot, yet which shelters here and there some verdant date trees, once an important city containing 6 public markets and 26 mosques, and whose walls, defended by 14 forts, formed a girdle of 2 miles in circumference. The Nautilus then approached the African shore, where the depth of the sea was greater. There, between 2 waters, clear as crystal, through the open panels, we were allowed to contemplate the beautiful bushes of brilliant coral and large blocks of rock, clothed with a splendid fur of green variety of sights and landscapes along these sandbanks and algae and fuci. What an indescribable spectacle! And what varieties of sights and landscapes along these sandbanks and volcanic islands which bound the Libyan coast! But where these shrubs appeared in all their beauty was on the eastern coast, which the Nautilus soon gained. It was on the coast of Tehama, for there not only did this display of zoophytes flourish beneath the level of the sea, but they also formed picturesque interlacings which unfolded themselves about 60 feet above the surface, more capricious but less highly colored than those whose freshness was kept up by the vital power of the waters. What charming hours I passed thus at the window of the saloon! What new specimens of submarine flora and fauna did I admire under the brightness of our electric lantern! The 9th of February, the Nautilus floated in the broadest part of the Red Sea, which is comprised between Suakin on the west coast and Kumfida on the east coast, with a diameter of 90 miles. That day at noon, after the bearings were taken, Captain Nemo mounted the platform, where I happened to be, and I was determined not to let him go down again without at least pressing him regarding his ulterior projects. As soon as he saw me, he approached and graciously offered me a cigar. Well, sir, does this Red Sea please you? Have you sufficiently observed the wonders it covers, its fishes, its zoophytes, its parterres of sponges, and its forests of coral? Did you catch a glimpse of the towns on its border? Yes, Captain Nemo, I replied, and the Nautilus is wonderfully fitted for such a study. Ah, it is an intelligent boat. Yes, sir, intelligent and invulnerable. It fears neither the terrible tempests of the Red Sea, nor its currents, nor its sandbanks. Certainly, said I. This sea is quoted as one of the worst, and in the time of the ancients, if I am not mistaken, its reputation was detestable. Detestable, Monsieur Aronnax. The Greek and the Latin historians do not speak favorably of it, and the Strabos says it is very dangerous during the Estian winds and in the rainy season. The Arabian Idrisi portrays it under the name of the Gulf of Kulzum, and relates that vessels perish there in great numbers on the sandbanks, and that no one would risk sailing in the night. It is, he pretends, a sea subject to fearful hurricanes, strewn with inhospitable islands, and which offers nothing good either on its surface or in its depths. One may see, I replied, that these historians never sailed on board the Nautilus. Just so, replied the captain, smiling, and in that respect, moderns are not more advanced than the ancients. It requires many ages to find out the mechanical power of steam. Who knows if, in another 100 years, we may not see a second Nautilus? Progress is slow, Monsieur Aronnax. It is true, I answered. Your boat is at least a century before its time, perhaps an era. What a misfortune that the secret of such an invention should die with its inventor. Captain Nemo did not reply. After some minutes' silence, he continued, You were speaking of the opinions of the ancient historians upon the dangerous navigation of the Red Sea. It is true, said I, but were not their fears exaggerated? Yes and no, Monsieur Aronnax, replied Captain Nemo, who seemed to know the Red Sea by heart. That which is no longer dangerous for a modern vessel, well-rigged, strongly built, and master of its own course, thanks to the obedient steam, offered all sorts of perils to the ships of the ancients. Picture to yourself those first navigators venturing in ships made of planks sewn with the cords of the palm tree, saturated with the grease of the sea dog, and covered with powdered resin. They had not even instruments wherewith to take their bearings, and they went by guess amongst currents of which they scarcely knew anything. Under such conditions, shipwrecks were and must have been numerous. But in our time, steamers running between Suez and the South Seas have nothing more to fear from the fury of this gulf, in spite of contrary trade winds. The captain and passengers do not prepare for their departure by offering proprietary sacrifices, and on their return they no longer go ornamented with wreaths or gilt fillets to thank the gods in the neighboring temple. I agree with you, said I, and steam seems to have killed all gratitude in the hearts of sailors. But, Captain, since you seem to have specially studied the sea, can you tell me the origin of its name? There exist several explanations on the subject, Monsieur Aronnax. Would you like to know the opinion of a chronicler of the 14th century? Willingly. This fanciful writer pretends that its name was given to it after the passage of the Israelites, when Pharaoh perished in the waves which closed at the voice of Moses. A poet's explanation, Captain Nemo, I replied, but I cannot content myself with that. I ask you for your personal opinion. Here it is, Monsieur Aronnax. According to my idea, we must see in this appellation of the Red Sea a translation of the Hebrew word Edom, and if the ancients gave it that name, it was on account of the particular color of its waters. But up to this time I have seen nothing but transparent waves, and without any particular color. Very likely, but as we advance to the bottom of the gulf, you will see the singular appearance. I remember seeing the Bay of Tor, entirely red, like a sea of blood. And you attribute this color to the presence of a microscopic seaweed. Yes. So, Captain Nemo, it is not the first time you have overrun the Red Sea on board the Nautilus? No, sir. As you spoke a while ago of the passage of the Israelites and of the catastrophe to the Egyptians, I will ask whether you have met with the traces under the water of this great historical fact. No, sir, and for good reason. What is it? It is that the spot where Moses and his people pass is now so blocked up with sand that the camels can barely bathe their legs there. You can well understand that there would not be water enough for my Nautilus. And the spot? I asked. The spot is situated a little above the Isthmus of Suez, in the arm which formerly made a deep estuary. where the Red Sea extended to the Salt Lakes. Now, whether this passage were miraculous or not, the Israelites nevertheless crossed there to reach the Promised Land, and Pharaoh's army perished precisely on that spot, and I think that excavations made in the middle of the sand would bring to light a large number of arms and instruments of Egyptian origin. That is evident, I replied, and for the sake of archaeologists, let us hope that these excavations will be made sooner or later, when new towns are established on the isthmus after the construction of the Suez Canal, a canal, however, very useless to a vessel like the Nautilus. Very likely, but useful to the whole world, said Captain Nemo. The ancients well understood the utility of a communication between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean for their commercial affairs, but they did not think of digging a canal direct and took the Nile as an intermediate. Very probably, the canal which united the Nile to the Red Sea was begun by Sesostris, if we may believe tradition. One thing is certain, that in the year 1615 before Jesus Christ, Necos undertook the works of an alimentary canal to the waters of the Nile across the plain of Egypt, looking towards Arabia. It took 4 days to go up this canal, and it was so wide that 2 triremes could go abreast. It was carried on by Darius, the son of Hystaspes, and probably finished by Ptolemy II. Strabo saw it navigated, but its decline from the port of departure, near Bubastis, to the Red Sea was so slight that it was only navigable for a few months in the year. This canal answered all commercial purposes in the age of Antonius, when it was abandoned and blocked up with sand. Restored by order of the Caliph Omar, it was definitely destroyed in 761 or 762 by Caliph al-Mansur, who wished to prevent the arrival of provisions to Muhammad bin Abdallah, who had revolted against him. During the expedition into Egypt, your General Bonaparte discovered traces of the works in the desert of the Suez, and, surprised by the tide, he nearly perished before regaining Hadjaroth, at the very place where Moses had encamped 3,000 years before him. Well, Captain, what the ancients dared not undertake, this junction between the 2 seas, which will shorten the road from Cadiz to India, Monsieur Lesseps has succeeded in doing, and before long he will have changed Africa into an immense island. Yes, Monsieur Aronnax, you have the right to be proud of your countrymen. Such a man brings more honor to a nation than great captains. He began, like so many others, with disgust and rebuffs, but he has triumphed, for he has the genius of will. And it is sad to think that a work like that, which ought to have been an international work, which would have sufficed to make a reign illustrious, should have succeeded by the energy of one man. All honor to Monsieur Lesseps. Yes, honor to the great citizen, I replied, surprised by the manner in which Captain Nemo had just spoken. Unfortunately, he continued, I cannot take you through the Suez Canal, but you will be able to see the long jetty of Port Said after tomorrow, when we shall be in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean, I exclaimed. Yes, sir, does this astonish you? What astonishes me is to think that we shall be there the day after tomorrow. Indeed? Yes, Captain, although by this time I ought to have accustomed myself to be surprised at nothing since I have been on board your boat. But the cause of this surprise? Well, it is the fearful speed you will have to put on the Nautilus, if the day after tomorrow she is to be in the Mediterranean, having made the round of Africa and doubled the Cape of Good Hope. Who told you that she would make the round of Africa and double the Cape of Good Hope, sir? Well, unless the Nautilus sails on dry land and passes above the isthmus, or beneath it, Monsieur Aronnax. Beneath it? Certainly, replied Captain Nemo quietly. A long time ago, nature made under this tongue of land what man has this day made on its surface. What? Such a passage exists? Yes, a subterranean passage which I have named the Arabian Tunnel. It takes us beneath Suez and opens into the Gulf of Pelusium. But this isthmus is composed of nothing but quicksands, to a certain depth, but at 55 yards only there is a solid layer of rock. Did you discover this passage by chance? I asked, more and more surprised. Chance and reasoning, sir, and by reasoning even more than by chance. Not only does this passage exist, but I have profited by it several times. Without that, I should not have ventured this day into the impassable Red Sea. I noticed that In the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean, there existed a certain number of fishes of a kind perfectly identical. Certain of the fact, I asked myself, was it possible that there was no communication between the two seas? If there was, the subterranean current must necessarily run from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, from the sole cause of difference of level. I caught a large number of fishes in the neighborhood of Suez. I passed a copper ring through their tails and threw them back into the sea. Some months later, on the coast of Syria, I caught some of my fish ornamented with the ring. Thus the communication between the two was proved. I then sought for it with my Nautilus. I discovered it, ventured into it, and before long, sir, you too will have passed through my Arabian Tunnel. Ooh. All right, so we have something to look forward to in the next chapter, the next time we meet tomorrow. So, that was an interesting chapter. I felt like it was a little hard to comprehend exactly. It came across to me as though they were maybe talking about events of their time, with the Suez Canal being built, and maybe the politics surrounding it. I'm not sure. So I'll try to do a little bit of digging, and maybe that will. It might be the case that it's simply a piece of topical interest of the time. I'm wondering if it has any real substance to the narrative of the story, but we'll see. Might just be a piece of world building. But we will continue on to Chapter 5 tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please do join us today. We have a great program today on Desert Storm, Operation Desert Storm during the Gulf War. That's going to be led by historian Glenn Kyle at 2 p.m. Eastern today on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. If you have not become a digital member, I do encourage you to become a digital member, because starting May 25th, we're going to offer 2 live streams a week. One is for the general public and non-members, and we'll have another special live stream for digital members. Now, it's only $3 a month or $35 for the year to become a digital member. You can, of course, give what you can. We encourage you to increase your donation if you can. But let me put the link in there for our digital memberships, and it's a pretty easy process. Let's see, member, there we go. So I put a link in our Facebook chat. I will put a link in our YouTube chat as well. And yes, please do join us today at 2 p.m. Eastern for our live stream on Desert Storm. And in the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy and happy, and I will see you tomorrow at noon.